first sighting of the Messerschmitt 262 caused literal panic amongst Allied bomber crews. Out on a routine bombing mission, they were suddenly being attacked by aircraft that they had never seen before. They were going 150 miles per hour faster than the aircraft that were supposed to be protecting them. This futuristic fighter was screaming past them, seemingly outrunning their bullets. Like a ghost, it would appear and disappear into the ether, leaving behind nothing but fear for the crews of the droning bombers. It was here, at Weingut-I, that production of the jet engines that were used on the Messerschmitt 262 would be assembled in massive underground bunkers 9 stories tall, protecting the production from the fierce Allied bombing campaigns that were focused on destroying the Luftwaffe entirely. Suck, squeeze, bang, blow. Those are the basic tenets of a jet engine. What do you think I was getting at? Air is sucked in through the intake, compressed using turbines and force, mixed with fuel and ignited, and ejected out the back, causing an equal and opposite reaction to whatever the device is fitted to. This was a novel concept during its inception in the 1930s, and understandably so. Orville Wright was still alive when Hans von Ohain and Frank Whittle conceptualized and constructed the first jet engines in 1936 and 1937, 33 years after the first flight at Kitty Hawk. Hans von Ohain's was the first operational variant when it was adopted by the Third Reich shortly after the invasion of Poland. This technology was so advanced with operational usage in its infancy that the complexes that developed and constructed them were needed to be designed and constructed specifically to support them. Standard propeller-driven aircraft were the norm, and factories were already in existence to mass-produce them. The jet engine would need its own facilities, tooling, and manufacturing processes, and it would need a host as well, a plane designed for it. Thus entered the Messerschmitt 262, the Swallow, one of dozens of the Nazi Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapons. These super weapons were prototypes meant to strike fear in the Allies, and most were just exotic or enormous versions of already operational things, like huge aircraft carriers, submarines, battleships, and 1,000-ton super tanks. There were also designs for rocket-powered ramjet and suborbital planes, flying wings, and even VTOL aircraft, helicopters, nuclear reactors, and night vision devices. But what was even scarier was that the Nazis actually built many of their designs and even operated them in combat, notably the V-2 rocket attacks on London, the 800mm Schwerer Gustav railway gun, and of course, the Messerschmitt 262. These operational Wunderwaffe had their own specially built facilities. The Messerschmitt 262s would be here in southern Germany, with construction and assembly being done underground in Weingut-I. These massive bunkers would allow the Reich to mass-produce the Wonder plane and prevent the Allies from coming anywhere close to the industrial cities that supported the German war machine. At least they hoped they would. As the Battle of Britain and the planned invasion of Normandy was underway, the Allies realized that air superiority was going to be the primary means of success. The German Luftwaffe controlled the skies over continental Europe and also in some cases over the Allies. They were producing 2,000 to 3,000 aircraft every single month. Defeating the Luftwaffe in the air was proving to be more difficult than imagined, and a method had to be devised to prevent their interference with the coming Allied assault. The solution would be attacking the aircraft when they were most vulnerable, on the ground. This wasn't just by bombing operational aircraft at the air bases, but also destroying the means of their production, the vital factories, foundries, and complexes that supported the Luftwaffe construction. Everything from ball bearings to fuel depots to ordnance shops were necessary to keep the Nazis' air superiority over continental Europe. And both they and the Allies knew this. In the preceding years, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators had been steadily pressing their attacks deeper into Germany, probing the airways for gaps and weaknesses. Overlapping fire in conjunction with fighter escorts protected their flanks and rear as they drove their formations over the industrial complex centers of the Third Reich. The Nazis retaliated with their own mass attacks, with air raids trading back and forth. Thousands of aircraft and aircrew were lost on both sides, with Germany stubbornly holding control. What followed was known as the Big Week. The Allies sent over 10,000 aircraft into Germany over a 5-day span in order to try and ground the entire Luftwaffe fleet in February of 1944. 6,000 of which were bombers. Their goal was twofold: bait the Luftwaffe into fights so they could try and shoot them down, and decimate anything associated with the Germans' ability to get a fighter aircraft into its final assembly. The Allies expected fierce resistance, with an estimated 7 to 18% of aircraft launched to be lost each day. Over a 5 to 6 day period, that would result in as few as 42% of aircraft lost to as high as 100%. It was essentially a suicide mission, reminiscent of the Doolittle raid. The US commander essentially signed off and assumed 75% destruction of his force of aircraft and crew. But this would not be the apocalyptic event that was foreseen. Hundreds of aircraft were lost and thousands of aircrew were killed or captured on both sides, but not nearly as many as predicted. The Allies did lose more than the Germans, but the end result was air superiority over the Luftwaffe, which was exactly what they were attempting to do. What it inspired in the Germans, though, was the necessity to not only reclaim air superiority, but also protect their means of production. They needed to go underground. What followed then, here in the Mühldorf forest in southern Germany, was the plan, development, and construction of Weingut-I, an enormous reinforced concrete barrel vault bunker. 12 massive arches were to be constructed, with 9 stories of dirt and gravel excavated from underneath them in order to house the factory that would mass produce the required engines and parts for the Messerschmitt 262. With the Luftwaffe no longer able to ensure protection of the above-ground workshops around the Reich, this complex would both cover and conceal the manufacturing of the Wunderwaffe jet fighter. With an extremely optimistic timeline of 6 months to finish the construction, approval was given by the Fuhrer in April of 1944, and work began in July. The foundations for the abutments were poured 17 meters thick. 3-meter thick concrete was to be poured over the 12 arches that would compose a 400-meter-long vault, 85 meters wide. This vast bunker would later be reinforced to 5-meter thick concrete upon its initial completion, then covered with soil and vegetation to conceal it. Once the vault was completed, the earth underneath it would be excavated and removed to create the void that the factory would be built in. This was a massive undertaking. As was standard operating procedure for Nazi Germany's massive undertakings, slave labor would be used. The company, Polensky and Zollner, was subcontracted to plan and oversee the construction. Their workforce of 200 employees, with augments of around 1,000 Italian and affiliated Soviet companies, was far from what was needed to complete the mega project. Therefore, over 8,500 prisoners were forced into labor for the site. Most came from the Mühldorf concentration camp, and more camps were built for Soviet POWs shipped in from the Eastern Front. They worked in 2 shifts, 12 hours at a time, 4,000 workers on site at every moment of the day. Millions of man-hours, most of which was forced labor, slave labor, was put into the construction of Weingut-I. But despite the sheer amount of labor and effort put into its construction, by April of 1945, only 7 of the 12 concrete arches had been completed. Resource depletion within the Third Reich over the preceding year of the war made it incredibly difficult to source the required materials and machinery needed to quickly complete the project. More horribly, though, was the fact that prisoners were literally worked to death, further depleting the likelihood of the construction being finished. 3,000 would die from exhaustion, starvation, or beatings over the year it was being built. The Allies would reach Mühldorf in April of 1945, liberating the concentration camps, as well as taking over all of the infrastructure, including the bunkers here. The Americans in particular took great interest in the structures and decided to use it to test its effectiveness. With 125 tons of TNT, 6 of the 7 bunkers were destroyed in follow-on evaluations to the integrity of their design and construction. The research would go on to be used for proposed constructions of industrial installation projects within the US. The perpetrators of the war crimes associated with both the concentration camps as well as the construction of Weingut-I were put on trial over the following years. Executives of Polensky and Zollner were imprisoned for war crimes, and many of the SS commandants and guards were arrested and imprisoned. 2 would be hanged at Landsberg prison and are buried in unmarked graves at what is probably the world's evilest graveyard. I've got a video on that as well. With the collapse of the Third Reich, an ethical dilemma was born. Here was the enemy, composed of millions of fervent Nazi loyalists, and amongst them brilliant scientists and thinkers, many who had conspired with or had even been members of the highest echelons of the Nazi Party. The question arose then, did they all need to be imprisoned and duly executed, or could the Allies utilize their research, expertise, and intelligence? A compromise was made, and Operation Paperclip was enacted, which resulted in 1,600 scientists, engineers, and all sorts of other technical experts being brought to America by the federal government. Highest among these were those associated with rockets, aerodynamics, and nuclear projects. Amongst these men was Wernher von Braun, a former SS rocket engineer who co-developed the V2, but would go on to become the chief architect of the Saturn V launch vehicle for the Apollo program. Kurt de Bus was also brought to America, with nearly the same exact pedigree as von Braun. Included amongst the 1,600, though, was none other than Hans von Auheim, father of the German jet engine, and subsequently the Messerschmitt 262. He was put to work at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, eventually becoming the director of the Aeronautical Research Laboratory. In the end, Weingut-I would amount to almost nothing. Thousands of forced laborers would die, worked literally to death, just to see the mega project crumble, used only once, and to test its ability to resist explosion, far from its intended practice. All told, the ambitious construction would serve only as an expensive lesson in futility. It serves more now as a memory of a place that was meant to support the genesis of jet aviation, which is the nexus of almost all commercial aircraft today. On the other side of the war, the British were operating a secret submarine base that cost one German spy his life. Check out this video where I take you to Scotland and tell you what happened there.